Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, oil has come up as a key aspect of countless shows on the channel, simply because it influenced policy, industry, and strategy across all theaters. Today, the author of Oil and the Great Powers, links below, joins us to share more. Welcome, Dr. Toprani. But before I introduce him in there, I will just point out that he is speaking on behalf of himself as an individual, as a historian. He is working for the US government and military, but he doesn't speak for them. He speaks for himself. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. I'm just digging out of a major snowstorm we had in New England.
Yeah, it's crazy. You're getting the snowstorms, and Australia, my guest this morning, they've got a heat wave there. It's that weather across the world being what weather does. But oil. So it's something that has been influencing our militaries for decades. It influences the world. It's a commodity that we cannot not talk about. You've written about the First World War and the Second World War, but we're focused on the second. But to begin the conversation, in the First World War, what did the great powers kind of go into the war thinking about oil? What did they learn about oil and how to move it around during the war? And after the war, what did they come out of thinking, well, we better not do that again?
Well, it's important to answer that question and indeed to think about what does oil mean to the great powers during the Second World War. We need to disaggregate the different powers because they're all in a different situation. They have different geographic and resource different geographic constraints, different resource endowments, different political economies, different militaries, different warfighting doctrines. And all of that is going to play a major role in terms of how it is they view oil and how it's going to shape their approach to warfighting, their industrial mobilization, and their sort of wider foreign policy and grand strategy. So let's just look at some of the big powers and try to answer this on a sort of contextual, on a specific basis. So to say that oil was not a major consideration before the First World War would only apply to nations that were not heavily involved in the maritime domain, first off. So obviously, I think if you're France or you're Germany or you're Russia or Austria-Hungary, it's not going to be a major consideration because your armies are primarily infantry and artillery backed by horse-drawn artillery. If, however, you're operating in the maritime domain, like the United Kingdom, like the United States, then you're dealing with the fact that oil has emerged as a new potential source of energy. And energy, briefly defined, is the ability to do work. So human beings consume energy every day in the form of food. It's how we're able to do work. So we can think of energy, oil primarily. When oil becomes a commodity in the 19th century, it's primarily as a source of illumination. There are some industrial uses for lubrication, but in the United States, Standard Oil is developed. Standard Oil's major commodity is kerosene because you need to have lighting for homes, and kerosene is the most important. And you'll sometimes use kerosene for cooking purposes, but it's primarily a source of illumination. As you have the development of the internal combustion engine, suddenly there's a need for this product, gasoline, which actually had been a waste product from refining of oil beforehand. And now you're going to use the internal combustion engine, opens up a whole new sort of vista of different technologies, whether it is going to be land transportation, whether it'll be heavier than air transportation. But that is all still a ways off. The biggest thing that the biggest energy role that oil can play, especially in the military domain, is as a source of naval propulsion. Because primarily, when you had for hundreds of years, ships had never had to worry about energy because you relied on the wind. And the wind took you wherever you needed to go. There are problems with wind. It doesn't travel. It doesn't take you very fast. If it's not blowing, there are problems. The wind only blows in certain areas in certain directions. It really imposes limits on your ability, on your mobility, even if it is a free resource. When you move to coal allows you to generate far more energy than the wind, and it allows you to create armored ships that have greater protection through the use of armor plating, and of course they have more modern sorts of rifled guns that can project shells much farther than traditional sort of smooth barreled guns which you had used on wooden warships. So in the 19th century, most navies, in the second half of the 19th century, there's a gradual sort of transition from sail to steam, relying primarily on coal. But there are problems with coal in the sense of coal takes up a lot of space. And if you're going to move a warship with large amounts of coal, it's not going to get very far because you're basically burning, what you can keep in your stores. Coal is incredibly dirty, dangerous. Sort of handling coal is incredibly dirty and dangerous. And one thing that ships find is that they cannot actually refuel at sea once their coal runs out. So if they run out of coal, they're either stranded or they've got to find a coaling station. And this actually poses major problems for the United States Navy during the Spanish-American War, that we would not have been able to, Admiral Dewey would not have been able to destroy the Spanish fleet at Manila had it not been for the fact that the British at Hong Kong allowed him to sort of coal up his ships so that he could go to the Philippines. The Great White Fleet that Theodore Roosevelt sends around the world to sort of showcase America's emergence as a great naval power. The Great White Fleet would have been stranded had it not been able to rely on British coaling supplies. So coal, it allows the development of modern warfare, but there are problems in terms of its efficiency and its utility in a wartime setting. And this then means that there's a market for then using oil rather than coal to generate, generate the heat that'll be necessary to sort of power the boilers that'll move the ships. And oil has certain advantages in the sense of much easier to handle, much higher energy density, about 40% higher energy density, and it can be also refueled at sea. I mean, it was almost virtually impossible to refuel coal, ships at sea using coal, but you could actually, with some practice, refuel ships at sea using oil. And of course, so this is a major, potentially a game changer for a maritime power like the UK, which is also at this time under Jackie Fisher is also transitioning towards what we will call the dreadnought, sort of uniform designs of, big gun, big armored ships with an incredibly high speed, none of which would have been possible, mind you, without the additional propulsive power of oil. But the problem the British have is that while they have lots and lots of coal, and in fact, some of the best coal for naval purposes, coal from Wales, Britain has no oil. So it faces this conundrum on the eve of the First World War, starting around 1912, especially, that everyone recognizes that if it's going to maintain its qualitative advantage, because other nations are growing, Britain cannot maintain, this overwhelming numerical preponderance over all of its potential rivals. It needs to, if it's going to safeguard its qualitative advantage, it needs to move to oil. But this is not a commodity that Britain has. And so the British government takes a sort of unprecedented, except in one case, an almost unprecedented decision before the First World War to buy stakes, a majority stake within what is known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which holds a massive concession in Iran, which is the only place at this time where there are proven oil reserves. It's one thing that your viewers ought to be aware of. When we think of world oil production today, that world came into existence after the Second World War.
Right.
The world that existed before the Second World War was a world where the center of oil production was not the Middle East. It was actually North America and the Caribbean, mainly Venezuela and Mexico. It's an entirely different geography of oil, different producers, different exporters, different consumers. And it is one that is primarily driven towards military needs, because these commodities outside of the United States, there isn't a lot of demand for petroleum products for civilian uses. The United States is an outlier because we we're not the birthplace of the automobile, but we are the birthplace of automobile culture and the mass production of automobiles, which are also suited towards America's geography as well. So there's a massive demand for gasoline in the United States, but not so much in other countries. Ships do not use gasoline, of course. There are attempts, to try and make diesel fuel, before the Second World War, make diesel fuel an effective fuel source for ships. But the diesel technology doesn't really work as well as it can. If you're a large ship, you're going to use a heavier fuel oil, which is also one of the reasons why Iran is going to be a potentially valuable supplier for the UK. And then, but then of course, there's another change, is that once you have oil products available and you have all these different products that you're not able to use, you need to find a way to use them. You need to find a way to use gasoline or lighter distillates of petroleum. And one thing you can use them for is land transportation and heavier than air transportation, but also submersibles, because the submersible technology had existed since the 18th century. There had been attempts to use submersibles in the American Civil War, even successfully to a certain extent, other than the fact that the Confederates kept killing their crews. But the technology's there, but the fuel isn't there. However, you are able to sort of create diesel engines that can be used to sort of power submarines. You're able to use gasoline that can power trucks or can power aircraft. And of course, some of these products, especially diesel, is going to play a major role in terms of the mechanization of agriculture as well. And you might think, well, why is this relevant in the military context? Well, where do you think all these soldiers are going to come from? Soldiers are primarily, before the 20th century, very few societies were primarily urban. The large excess manpower was going to come from the agricultural sector. But if you're pulling all these people into armies, who's going to produce the food that your society needs in order to do its job, in order to sort of sustain the war effort? So mechanization of agriculture, and this will be especially important for Europe, depends increasingly not on oil products, and oil products will also be increasingly used for purposes of generating fertilizer and other things like that. So before the First World War, there's an increasing demand for petroleum to fulfill all of these functions that we will understand, but they are not essential. And I'm sorry I'm going on too much. I don't get a chance to talk about it.
No, not at all. Don't worry. Fantastic.
But I think it's worth bearing in mind, despite the fact that oil is playing an increasingly larger and larger role in terms of civilian and military consumption, the First World War is fought and won primarily using technologies of the 19th century. Yeah. Right? There's very little there's a little bit of motorization that goes on, but most troops are still marching or moving by rail. Heavy artillery is still largely moved by horse. There are some tanks, obviously, that are used very late in the game, but it's hard to say they played an especially large role in smashing the German lines in 1918. So the First World War is fought and won primarily using the technologies of the 19th century. But one thing that is very interesting is that while everyone at the time understood that, they also understood the next war, and there would be another war. The military was fairly certain there would be another war, especially if you were in the German military. Everyone understood the next war would be an oil war, because they could see where this technology was moving, that navies were increasingly moving towards the use of oil rather than coal as the primary source of propulsion. The UK had made that decision in 1912 to commit to building its newest ships using only burning oil, not just there had been an effort to try and have them burn coal or oil. It just wasn't efficient. They made the move towards oil only. And in fact, it was Winston Churchill in one of his most important contributions to sort of British policymaking who makes that decision. And he has a memorable line. People say, well, if we're cut off from oil, the Royal Navy will be stranded. You're creating this crippling vulnerability. He replies very, very, very adroitly, if we can't import oil, what makes you think we'll be able to import food? Either we keep the sea lanes open for everything, or we keep them open for nothing. And there's no point in worrying about the situation. So if we're already an import-dependent society, we might as well add oil to that list of things we need to import. So everyone is making that shift. And of course, during the First World War, you see larger and larger roles for, yes, of course, there's mechanized transportation, motorized transportation, the beginnings of mechanized warfare with the use of tanks, starting the Somme and especially at Cambrai the following year. And then had the war lasted in 1919, if you believe JFC Fuller and the Plan 19 advocates, the Allies would have crushed the Germans using an army that looks more like the armies of the Second World War than those of the First World War. Large numbers of tanks and aircraft in a close air support role. You also see the development at the end of the First World War of strategic bombing, what we will call strategic bombing, or in the UK, you call it area bombing, we call it precision bombing, but it's all strategic bombing. That I can use aircraft to support the troops on the battlefield, or I can use aircraft to either destroy supplies or interdict them from coming to the battlefield. That's strategic bombing. There's already a move towards the idea of using long-range aircraft to strike at first with Zeppelins, but then of course with bombers like the Gotha bomber, of using them to strike at enemy cities and enemy industrial facilities. And of course, the great theorist of this period, and one I had to just teach to my students yesterday, is the Italian Due, and his command of the air is a remarkable sort of remarkable exposition of where warfare is going and what role strategic bombing can play in all of that. And all of that is possible only with oil. So it's important to say that, again, oil doesn't really play a huge role in the outcome of the First World War, but everyone understands it will be incredibly important in the next war, and the winners are incredibly keen, especially the UK, but also France, to ensure that that when there's a division of spoils at the end of the war, that they will secure their oil needs. And those oil needs can only be met through control of potentially oil-bearing territories in what is then the Ottoman Empire and what we will call the Middle East today. And so in 1918, the British government makes a very concerted move that it will, as the Ottoman Empire is collapsing, Britain will take possession of potential oil-bearing territories in what is today Iraq, in northern Iraq, Mosul, Kirkuk is sort of, northern Iraq, Kurdish areas, which are seen as the most promising places where you will find oil in the Middle East outside of Iran. Interestingly, no one's thinking about Saudi Arabia. That is the empty quarter. No one really cares about that, and it's one of the reasons why it's not something that they will fight over at the Treaty of Versailles. So again, when we're talking about oil's impact on the First World War, the best you can say is that Germany's shortage exacerbates some of its existing industrial difficulties. There's a shortage of industrial lubricants, which holds back production in certain ways. But honestly, I think, and Ludendorff sort of mentions this in his war memoirs, I mean, one of the biggest problems the Germans had was people were just living in the dark. When winter came, there was, and it was dark, there was nothing there to provide illumination. So because there was no kerosene. And of course, the Germans are experimenting with some different kinds of synthetic fuels produced from coal, which they will increasingly rely on after the First World War. But these fuels were generally of low quality, and they're not able to create huge supplies. But again, it's hard to say that it's hard to say that a shortage of oil is the reason why Germany loses in the First World War, because ultimately it loses because its strategy its strategy had failed, and it is caught in a material, Germans call it the Materialschlacht in the Western Front, that it cannot match the industrial output of the British and their allies, and of course the United States that is there backing them. Casualties are too high. The war protracts, and ultimately the Germans are not able to really make gains except at sort of horrific casualties. Technology really isn't there for them to be able to sort of break the stalemate of the trenches, except at tremendous human loss. So oil is at most it is a contributing factor to Germany's defeat. But again, everyone understood direction of warfare was, I've read German documents which say like the next war will be an oil war, and Germans understood this, and of course the British and the French understood this. The Americans didn't need to understand this because they were already an oil society. Like,
right, yes,
this had already happened for them, and they were already, the United States at this period had produced roughly 2/3 of all the oil ever produced in human existence. I mean, it is just they are so far ahead of everyone else when it comes to the size of their oil industry, its sophistication, and its sort of global reach. The Europeans are aware of their shortcomings, and they are aware of the fact that they need to take corrective action. The British and the French make the decision that the Middle East is a logical place where they will either on their own or collaboratively work to develop the region's oil as an alternative to reliance on the United States. And of course, it makes sense that for the British, who already have their most important asset in the region was of course the canal beforehand, it makes sense to expand your presence in the region because you were already concerned about keeping out foreign powers in order to protect your interest in the canal zone. So the Middle East is already important, and it makes sense to develop it farther as a way of linking your possessions east and west of Suez. So that is a very long-winded way of trying to sort of set up the outlook before the Second World War.
Long-winded, you may say, but fantastic. So you talked there about everybody coming out the First World War with the realization that oil is going to be essential. Now, when other things are going on with the militaries, I don't know, developing of gliders or airborne technology, that can be done to some extent behind closed doors. You don't have to reveal what you're doing to other nations. But if you're going to be setting up oil supply routes to the Middle East and all the facilities that entails, that's very public. So it seems to me already that Germany are struggling to recognize this, and certainly if they're recognizing it, they're not doing enough to implement it. And we had a question earlier from one of the viewers, Marco, saying, why was Germany so under-mechanized and didn't do more to secure oil supplies? I mean, he's talking about World War II, but I mean, talking about sort of the 20s and 30s, because paradoxically, there's that weird thing where the Germans are ahead of the game in so many things. You could argue aircraft design, tank design, and yet as a country, I mean, James Holland makes this point, they have one of the lowest percentages of people who can drive a car come 1939. They're in some ways still very reliant, well, not in some ways, many ways reliant on horse transport. As you say, you're talking about the lighting of their homes. How did they let the 20s and 30s go past without addressing that?
Well, again, you need to ask yourself, well, what is Germany's political objective in the wake of the First World War? If your political objective is and I think I have my issues with him on multiple levels, but Adam Tooze in his Wages of Destruction he sort of hints at it, and then he develops it more in his book The Deluge. But he says, there are two alternative visions in the 1920s about what role Germany can play. And Japan actually has a very similar sort of, choice before it. On the one hand, you can acknowledge that Germany is far too weak to play the role of an independent great power. that if Germany's prosperity and security is to be safeguarded, it can only be within the framework of an Anglo-American security and economic framework. That means adjusting yourself and accommodating yourself to what New York, Washington, the City of London, what they need. And that means also giving up hope of revisionism and hope of basically acting of adopting a policy at odds or independent of these powers. In other words, the policy that the Federal Republic followed after the Second World War. If that is what you're interested in, if you just want to generate material prosperity for ordinary Germans, so they can buy automobiles, so they can, properly heat and light their homes. If that's all you're interested in, there's a way to do that. The alternative view, the view that is now the first view is epitomized by the great German statesman Gustav Stresemann, who becomes foreign minister in 1923, wins along with Austin Chamberlain and Aristide Briand the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926 for the Locarno treaties. He is a sort of architect of this sort of view that Konrad Adenauer will embrace after the Second World War. The alternative viewpoint is the viewpoint that is epitomized by Adolf Hitler. And it's the viewpoint that he expresses, lots of people like to say, well, if people had just read Mein Kampf, they would not have been surprised by anything Hitler did. And first of all, I point out that there are a few books that are more cited and less read than Mein Kampf. I've not read the whole thing. I've only read parts of it. But I will be very clear. The parts that I've read do not really provide a roadmap to the Second World War. I mean, yes, he's talking about Lebensraum, but frankly, he's also talking about what a hash the statesmen of the Wilhelmine period had made of Germany's strategic position by alienating Britain. He's willing to buy Italian friendship by basically handing over the Tyrolean German population, who had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to the Italians. He is all about accommodating in the West so that he can focus on Lebensraum in the East, and it's all about Ukraine and agriculture, and it's sort of a pre-modern sort of perspective. I mean, if you read that book, what you'd think is, well, Hitler's actually wants to be the friend of the UK, and he only wants to attack Russia for Lebensraum. And frankly, are there worse things than two of the worst dictators in the world, Hitler and Stalin, killing one another? Mm. And in fact, in the 1930s, it would be hard to claim that somehow Hitler was more bloodthirsty than Stalin. I mean, only one guy in the 1930s has millions of people murdered under his watch, and it ain't Adolf Hitler. The problem, however, is that Hitler's views are expressed secretly in his so-called second book, which is the one that is the continuation of Mein Kampf, but focused entirely on foreign policy. And once his people actually read that book, they said, no, you can't actually let anybody read this book, because once they read this book, then the jig is up. Because there, Hitler makes very clear, Germany has to be a world power, and actually our long-term foe is not the UK. It's not even Russia or Judeo-Bolshevism or what have you. It's actually the United States. That the world's future will be a struggle between, a German-led European order versus, the American order in North America. That's how he sees this all playing out. He even mentions that, oil fields will have the same importance in the 20th century as coal fields had in the 19th century. He doesn't develop it so much, but he's aware of it. So you have these two different visions about where Germany can go. Either Germany, and Hitler makes this point, very clearly, Germany will either be a world power or will cease to exist.
Right.
To be more specific, Germany will either be a world power or it will be a wealthy, contented nation, but it cannot do both. And if you're going to try to be a world power, that will come at the expense of your development of your civilian economy and the sort of prosperity of your individual citizens, because that honestly is not something that interested not just Nazi leaders. I'm not certain that they're any sort of member of the German elite, the German elite who had sort of led Germany in the First World War and still played an incredibly important role in German society, even after the First World War, even during the Nazi period. We're talking here the sort of Prussian Junkers, if you will, or the traditional establishments within Germany, the military, the civil service, the universities, the professions. These people are more interested in Germany's sort of status than they are about its sort of prosperity. So, in a sense, if you're going to ask, well, why didn't Germany become a modern, prosperous society in the 1920s when it became one in the 1950s and 60s? The answer has to do with, well, what sort of Germany did you want to have? Was Germany supposed to be a world power, or was it supposed to be a responsible member of an Anglo-American transatlantic alliance? That was a choice that was on offer theoretically in the 1920s. And it was certainly, again, on offer after World War II. Germany made a certain decision, not entirely of its own choosing. Tooze's central point is that this order collapses because of the Great Depression. That had there been no Great Depression, Germany may have indeed have developed along those lines that Stresemann and others had wanted. But the Great Depression foreclosed that. It shattered, any hope of sort of creating a transatlantic framework, and it completely discredited the governments that had emerged after the First World War, not just in Germany, but also, throughout Europe and even in the United States, and led to the rise of new governments with entirely new ideas about management of the economy and the role of the state relative to the economy. That's the same that's as much the case in the United States as it is within Germany, even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal are about as different as you can get from the Nazis in terms of their temperament. These are governments that, again, are represent a fundamental discontinuity with what had happened beforehand, and without the shock of the Great Depression, it's hard to imagine that either would have emerged, and we would have had a radically different sort of, development of the world. But that is, in a sense, I think, that is the answer to the question, because there are also problems, again, with the mechanics of how the post-war system was supposed to work. That if Germany was supposed to be this sort of motorized society, mechanized in the military context, it was supposed to be this motorized modern society that had same levels of per capita energy consumption and per capita wealth as you would have seen in Western Europe or in the United States. That would also imply that Germany was able to export what it needed to generate the earnings necessary to import those commodities. Now, that is always, and there's one historian, another guy named Peter Hayes, who is a sort of leading historian of I.G. Farben, at least in the English language. He makes this point. Germany has always had two choices. It can either have export-led growth or it can have conquest. Like, that has always been the choice, between it. And if you choose export-led growth, you're dependent on the Anglo-Americans to secure those links, because they're the ones who are the maritime power. Germany is just not in the position geographically to be able to safeguard its own imports. If you choose the conquest route, that means you are deferring civilian consumption for the sake of military production. And that just means that Germans might have jobs, they might have more money in their pockets, which they do in the 1930s, but actually they're working harder than they've ever been before. Their actual hourly wages are declining, and there's nothing to spend the money. And the money that they are saving is increasingly being harvested by the regime, by forced levies on German savings accounts. So Germans have jobs, but they don't necessarily have commodities to spend on those, to spend their money on, because everything is being devoted to military production. If you wanted to have a higher standard of living, you'd have to take that military production and turn it into exports. But how can you turn it into exports when international trade has collapsed, when there's no interest in in recreating a functioning international economy? And this had been a problem even in the 1920s before the Depression. This is something that John Maynard Keynes and others had warned about, that the problem with putting reparations on Germany was not not the amount of reparations, because they actually weren't that significant when you really get down to it. Certainly not compared to what the Germans had done to France after 1871, or what they plan to do to Russia under Brest-Litovsk. The problem is, how was Germany supposed to generate the export surplus necessary to pay for those reparations unless you were willing to accept German products? But then put it in France and Britain's position. The only way we get paid is if we open up our markets to underpriced German products that wipe out our domestic industries and mean that all the soldiers who spent 4 years fighting the Hun come home and have no jobs. How exactly does that suit our interest? And oh, by the way, they owe money to the United States, and the United States is demanding to be paid. So they have to protect their own markets so that they can generate money to pay the Americans. Then how are the Germans supposed to find markets for their goods? So the system has real problems in the 1920s, but there's no reason to think it couldn't have been gradually solved over time. But the Great Depression just sort of ends that,
right,
and forces the choice between, we can choose the peaceful route to prosperity, or we can choose the route of great power. The Germans don't choose the great power route, but they choose people who are inclined to pursue that, and that's why Germany ends up on this path.
Right. Brilliant stuff. Well, actually, you've really cleared some of that up for me now. So to move things along, because this is fascinating, but can we talk about kind of the state of play, sort of 1937, 1938, 39, because there are stocks of oil in various places. There are routes that have been established. We'll probably bring up other maps in a minute. The Germans certainly have begun thinking about what the next steps are, and other nations are accepting of the fact that, as you said earlier, another war is likely. So how is oil shared out at this point? What is notable that you want to explain to viewers about the situation leading up to the beginning of the Second World War?
Well, the funny thing is, when the nations who become the Allies are looking at Germany, they're thinking to themselves, wow, the Germans are in really bad position. I mean, they're not getting any amount of oil. How are they really going to maintain and fuel a large, modern military when there are such limited supplies? The Germans are having to import oil from places. One of their major suppliers, their major sources of imports were actually going to be the United States and Venezuela, neither of which is going to be terribly significant during the war. It's not Romania, actually. It's Venezuela and the United States in the 1930s. And the Germans can't really import very much oil because they don't have dollars to pay for that oil.
Right.
Because remember, they're not exporting, they don't have dollars or foreign exchange. So they're really limited by how much oil they can import. Everyone's looking at it, saying the Germans would be mad to try and wage a long war when they don't really have the ability to sustain one. Everything depends on the Germans being able to fight short, sharp wars. What the Germans call blitzkrieg. When we think of blitzkrieg, we think about combined arms, modern combined arms, about integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and close air support as sort of, as a web working together. That's not how the Germans understood it in the 1930s. The Germans understood blitzkrieg as, we need to fight short, sharp wars because those are the only ones we have the ability to. But if we're only fighting a short, sharp war that is limited in duration and scope and focused on a particular theater, whether it's going to be Czechoslovakia, whether it's going to be Poland, whether it's going to be France, if we're fighting those kinds of wars, well, then we can have first of all, it's not going to be a continuous sort of campaign. It's going to be short, sharp campaign. There'll be a breathing space, and then we'll move on to the next one. So you only have to generate certain kinds of forces to be able to do that. The bulk of your army, yes, will be infantry, but you can compensate for it by having an armored spearhead, a tip of the spear that can generate the sort of the initial breakthroughs and shatter the enemy, so that you can sort of wage these sort of battles of encirclement and destroy the enemy as close to the frontier as possible. The sort of oil is one way to think about it is that oil is a wonderful way of enabling the Germans to fight the wars that they had always wanted to fight,
Right.
not just under Hitler, not just, in the First World War, but right through to Germany's or Prussia's existence as a great power. Because again, Prussia and then Germany is in this sort of exposed position in the center of Europe. You don't really have, other than maybe the Rhine, you don't really have any natural barriers to protect you. You're resource constrained. Your opponents either have more people, more industry, or are wealthier and can rely on the resources of the world. You're stuck on whatever you can generate, from central Germany, which is not going to be a whole lot. So if you're going to fight this war, you need to take advantage of your interior lines of communication, because you are at the center of this. You can shift forces from one area to another. But again, Germany's way of fighting was to seek battles of annihilation as close to the beginning of the war as possible, so that your enemy would then sue for peace, because it just wasn't worth it to continue. And that was a model that that had been sort of, the Germans had tried to sort of perfect under Frederick the Great. Although there are debates of before the First World War about whether or not Frederick actually did this. General Staff has feuds with the founder of modern military history, a guy named Hans Delbruck. They have feuds over whether or not this is actually the case. This is what Moltke the Elder had tried to do in the Franco-Prussian War. And of course, it is what they are trying to do, I would argue, in the Schlieffen Plan, and then also with their initial campaigns in the Second World War. Blitzkrieg has to be seen as not just describing Germany's warfighting doctrine, but its overall military strategy. A strategy that is shaped by Germany's peculiar geographic positioning, but also its relative economic weakness to its adversaries. If you bear all of that in mind, then you can make do with fewer resources than your resource-intensive adversaries, who are always planning to wage protracted war. Because the British way of war, by its very nature, if you're going to rely on blockade and supplying allies on the continent, so Napoleonic playbook, the maritime way of war is a protracted war. It is slowly grinding the enemy down. That's where you need to have large amounts of capital and resources to sustain it. If you're waging short, sharp wars, you need a different force structure. That is sort of underpinning how the Germans are constructing their military, but it also means that their energy requirements are not as great as we would imagine them to be. And the Germans basically over the 1930s, and I don't want to sort of, basically what you can say is the Germans decide that they're going to do what in the United States we would call an all of the above policy. They're not going to rely on a single way to meet their oil needs. Because they're not so great, they decide that they're going to seek as many different alternatives as possible. So the most important source the Germans develop is after the First World War. There's more progress, because one of Germany's industrial advantages, is that the world's foremost chemical companies are German, particularly the firms that will comprise IG Farben, which was established in 1925. IG Farben is one of its constituent elements, its constituent companies. I don't want to sort of get into too much. One of its constituent companies had developed what is known as the Fader-Bosch process for producing synthetic nitrates. Synthetic nitrates are essential towards producing munitions, and also towards for fertilization. Before the First World War, everyone thought that because all nitrates, natural nitrates, were actually produced from bird droppings in islands in the Pacific, and it was thought that if Germany didn't have access to these supplies of bird guano, that it wouldn't be able to produce nitrates, and it wouldn't actually be able to produce artillery shells or fertilizer for agriculture. Before the First World War, the Haber-Bosch process is developed in Germany, which means that they have a way of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere, because again, it is 70% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. and fixing it in a usable, physical form that you can use in place of natural nitrates. Use these synthetic nitrates. One of the byproducts, however, of that process is it produces lots of hydrogen gas that you're looking for a way to use some of these byproducts from the production of synthetic nitrates, and they use these byproducts then. And I don't want to get into specifics, even I'm not a scientist, and certainly not a chemical engineer. They use these processes to basically bombard coal and liquefy it into petroleum. So there's this process of what's known as technological momentum in Germany, that German firms have this expertise. They have this unused capacity. They use this capacity with petroleum, with coal, to produce a product that they don't actually have. And so well before the Nazis come into being, in the early 1920s, these companies are saying, well, give us subsidies because we can produce oil within Germany, which you don't have to import from overseas. And this is a big ask because at this time, there's a lot of oil, in the world. There's no shortage of natural crude oil. Producing synthetic fuel out of coal is incredibly expensive. What people are arguing in the 1920s is that, one, this will be an immense, it'll create a market for German coal producers and German steel producers, because German coal will be liquefied into petroleum, and these synthetic fuel facilities are immense and require huge amounts of steel. This will provide a ready market for German steel. And, oh, by the way, we won't have to expend foreign exchange to import oil, and we will have a source of petroleum that will be blockade proof. And so people are making these arguments about economic and national security in the early 1920s. The problem is, Germany doesn't really, these processes are so expensive, and Germany isn't really in the 1920s thinking that it's going to create this mass army where war is really a possibility. People might want revision, but they're actually seeking revision diplomatically through Stresemann and others. There's no immediate sort of planning for a major war. And of course, the German military is constrained by Versailles. There's no air force. There's a tiny navy. There's not a huge, market for this petroleum domestically. So the economics don't really work. The Nazis come in, however, in 1933, and they say, we're on board with this because we can either import large amounts of oil and stockpile it, which is incredibly expensive because I got to spend dollars to import the oil, and then I got to create these huge refineries to process it, and huge storage facilities to hold it. And you can't store this stuff indefinitely as well. I mean, petroleum is a wasting asset. It can't be stored indefinitely. So I can either do that, or I can produce oil through coal, and not just oil, but lighter kinds of fuel that can be used to produce gasoline. Particularly, this is why German tanks run on gasoline, not on diesel. It's because synthetic fuel is more efficient for Haber-Bosch, which is one of the processes for producing synthetic fuel, produces lighter kinds of fuel. There's another thing called Fischer-Tropsch that can produce heavier kinds of fuel, but it isn't quite as efficient. And IG Farben owns the patent for Haber-Bosch, and IG Farben is a politically far better connected firm within the regime as well. So it's weird that all of this is happening. The regime is drawing upon economic expertise from a lot of these, from certain key connected firms like IG Farben. And so there's this weird sort of movement that IG Farben executives are going into the regime to serve as economic advisors, economic policymakers, and they are negotiating with their friends in the company. And so the regime signs a deal with IG Farben, but it's an IG Farben executives who are behind German, the regime's policies, moving it towards this direction. It's not to say that IG Farben is taking advantage of the government, but they are certainly putting their thumb on the scale. So, one of the weird things that I learned looking at this, looking at oil and the Third Reich is, whatever you say about the Third Reich's, power and its sort of coercive abilities in other aspects of German society, when it comes to oil policy, the Third Reich is very deferential to private interests. I mean,
Right.
it is not going to force them to do something that they do not want, because it doesn't have that expertise, and it leverages that expertise and that knowledge and that skill set, which it simply does not have. So it's not as though it's to say that IG Farb, that the Nazis are simply, as Marxist historians would say, that the Nazis are simply like frontmen for monopoly capitalism, like and it's actually the German businessmen who are running everything. Like that's overstated. But there's a real process of negotiation and mutual self-interested work, and so IG Farben and its people are able to sort of guarantee that the Third Reich will be will guarantee a large, sufficiently large orders of IG Farben synthetic gasoline to generate a very modest profit on what the firm had already invested in that production. Not a huge profit, but a very small profit, because one of the things the regime says is that once your profits go over a certain level, we get all of the excess profits. So basically, I'd have to look at the numbers again, but basically IG Farben is told, like, you can cap your profits at something like, say, 5%. Anything above that, we get the excess. So actually, the regime is subsidizing IG Farben for the first couple of years, but once Farben is able to really expand production and really start to make money, they're actually turning over their excess profits to the regime, and they're paying the German government. So it's a weird relationship. But all I'm going to say is that, again, Germany has this choice. Are they going to import large amounts of fuel and create stockpiles, or are they going to rely on synthetic fuel instead? They make a decision towards synthetic fuel. But there are still limitations, because, again, synthetic fuel produces certain kinds of commodities. And remember, if I'm using coal and steel for synthetic production, I'm not using it for military production.
Right.
The Strategic Bombing Survey estimated after World War II that on the eve of the Second World War, the Germans had invested in their synthetic fuel production enough steel to create a fleet 4 times the size of the Royal Navy in 1940. I mean, this is the German synthetic fuel effort is the German Manhattan Project for all intents and purposes. It's not the V2, which is sort of an afterthought. It's not, or it's certainly on the V1. Like, German synthetic fuel is an incredible, drag on Germany's economy. I mean, you are millions of tons of steel, tens of millions of tons of coal, not to produce weapons. It's to produce an intermediate good that will fuel other weapons. So if you're asking, well, why doesn't Germany have this huge mechanized, motorized army? Well, one, you don't have oil for it, and two, the oil you do have, you can only produce at the expense of other kinds of military production. So your shortage is not only constraining the composition of your forces, but also the size of those forces. But again, that's only maybe a real problem if you're planning to fight a long-term, protracted conventional war. If you're fighting a blitzkrieg, that's a different kettle of fish. Then you can just make use of expedience. So you will rely on synthetic fuel. Germany at that time does produce a tiny amount in Western Germany of crude oil. Not very much, but considering how little Germany required, every drop you got was a drop you didn't have to import. And of course, they are importing oil from overseas. Like I said, primarily from the United States and Venezuela. There are efforts in the 1930s, after the Mexican government nationalizes its oil industry in 1938. There are increasing efforts to try and develop Mexico as a supplier to Germany, and the German Navy is a strong proponent of that, but nobody else in the regime backs that, because this is sort of insane. You're going to rely on Mexico to support, support your war effort. Like it's not in the cards. The German Navy is trying to, because again, the German Navy is the one service that is actually loses out in this whole process, that you're producing gasoline that can be used for tanks and for aircraft, but you're not producing enough diesel and fuel oil for German surface ships and submarines. And so the Navy is sort of an afterthought and has to try and engage in all of these antics. It's going to try and develop northern Iraq as a potential supplier in competition with the British and the French. That fails. Then it tries to go to Mexico. It's doing all these weird things. But again, the regime isn't willing to really give it a lot of support, and it basically ignores the Navy when it tries to make these claims, because the German army, when it comes to which services have more political influence in Germany, the army is always going to be first, and the Air Force will be a close second because of Hermann Goering, and the Air Force is being seen as the most sort of national socialist of all the military services. So you're going to have synthetic fuel production. You're going to have limited amounts of crude oil. You're going to try and import what you can, as much as you can, from overseas. But when the Munich crisis hits, the Germans realize that they really don't have. This is still not enough. The Germans estimate that their total requirements in wartime, and I'm sort of going off the top of my head, are about 8 million tons a year. I mean, a trivial amount when you consider what American production is. I mean, it's just it's nothing. Right. The Germans feel that they can make do with 8 million tons a year to wage a blitzkrieg. The problem is that, you know, their synthetic production and their domestic production isn't large enough. They aren't able to stockpile enough. They're not going to be able to rely on imports from the United States and Venezuela, and the United States is really not very keen on sending any oil to Germany. And if there's a war, the Neutrality Acts would forbid it, assuming any oil even could get through. You know, Germany can't really rely on the United States or the Western Hemisphere, and that's when they make the decision that we really need to rely on Romania. That shift happens in the wake of the Munich crisis. It's in late 1938-39. German planners realize the only way to square the circle if war comes sooner rather than later is to develop Romania as our supplier. The problem is Romania is primarily a supplier to Britain and to France, and most of that oil went from the Black Sea through the Straits, through the Mediterranean, up to consumers in Western Europe. Germany could not rely on that transit route for obvious reasons if it's fighting Britain and France. So it would have to completely restructure the transportation of oil from Romania by moving it overland, moving it along the Danube, or by rail into Central Europe. And so fundamentally what the Germans are obsessed with in 1938-39 diplomatically is building a closer relationship to Romania, so that it will be, because Romania has made clear during the Munich crisis that they're not going to supply Germany. Like Romania is torn between factions that are that are tied. You know, and I don't know enough about Romanian domestic politics, but I would say it's broken up between factions that are some in the royal family are close to the UK, some are closer to the Germans. They've got the military probably leans more towards the Germans, mainly because of anti-Bolshevism, anti-communism, and of course you have the Iron Guard, which is these fascist lunatics who are there waiting in the wings. So Romania is an incredibly politically, fraught nation. It's incredibly fraught, but it is the only supplier of oil of any consequence in Europe, especially after production within Austria-Hungary and Galicia, which have been a major supplier of a significant producer of oil before World War I. All of that oil runs out, before and during the war. So Romania is all you're going to do. And so the Germans are working very hard to establish agreements with Romania that they will be able to secure X amount of oil, basically 2 to 3 million tons of oil, and they will reorient that trade away from the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They will move it by rail into Germany. that requires a series of diplomatic and commercial agreements, and German diplomats are going to Bucharest, and they are working very hard on doing that. But the result of all of that is that Romania is slowly but surely moving towards Germany, because Germany can protect it from Hungary, which is peeved about the loss of Transylvania, and of course there's the threat posed by the Soviet Union as well. The Romanians, have their issues with the Soviets and disputed sort of border areas, Bessarabia, what we call Moldova today. So the Romanians, they make the decision that the Poles did not make, which is that if you can either accommodate yourself to Germany, or you can rely on Britain and France. And I don't really blame the Romanians for making the decision that they were going to rely on Germany rather than Britain and France, because we saw what happened to the Poles. It's not when I make this comment to my Polish colleagues, and they don't really like to hear it, but AGP Taylor had the famous line, in 1945, would you rather have been a betrayed Czech or a saved Pole? It's hard for me to imagine that Poland would have would have been worse off had it not accommodated itself to Germany. The Romanians make a decision to accommodate themselves to Germany, and to not wholeheartedly move towards the Axis cause. I mean, they are aware of the nature of this relationship, but they will increasingly rely on Germany's largesse, because the Germans are not getting this oil for free. Like, they are sending advanced weaponry, which they need. They're sending it to Romania. The Romanians have a guaranteed sort of market for their food and energy exports. It just sort of makes sense for that relationship to unfold as it did. So once Romania sort of moves into a likely supplier of Axis oil, by the summer or fall of 39, reading German sort of war planning documents, they're actually convinced that they can do it. Between synthetic production, domestic production, imports from Romania, and what they had stockpiled over the years, that they could make blitzkrieg work. If the war turned out the way that it did, that if Germany could fight the wars that it always wanted to fight, they could somehow manage it in a way that to people in the West looked like lunacy, made sense within Germany's particular circumstances.
Wow. I mean, brilliant stuff. I mean, I'm thinking of that line in the Battle of Britain movie, and I am going somewhere with this, where Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, they're talking about radar, and the civil servant says, so you're trusting in radar and praying to God? And Dowding says, well, actually, it's the other way around. We're trusting in God and praying for radar. It seems to me that there's a praying for blitzkrieg to work. And everybody from every angle of military history is saying, as you've said there, the Germans just cannot possibly sustain a long war. So they've got the synthetic oil that they're producing, but as you're explaining, it's incredibly costly in steel and coal and everything else. They've got Romania, which they can crank up to a certain level, but the projections are going to be a little bit kind of guesswork, I suppose. And then there's the potential of moving east, and then there's a potential of Mediterranean. And also, this is what I go on my next question: denying resources to the enemy in the future, because there's producing your own stuff, and then there's making sure the enemy haven't got what they need to do. So the Third Reich is juggling a lot of plates come 1939. I mean, that's an understatement there. Meanwhile, how are the Soviet Union? I know we could go off on a massive great rabbit hole, but what are the Soviet Union doing? Because they're at this point, they're still on reasonably friendly terms with the Third Reich. And then, so what are they doing? If you could summarize that.
Well, you see, okay, the weird thing I had left out, I'm sorry, I left out that the Soviet Union did become a modest supplier of petroleum to Germany, but that's after Molotov-Ribbentrop, because in 1940, you have the German-Soviet commercial agreement in early 1940. So the Soviets end up sending about 1 million tons, maybe a little bit less, give or take, of petroleum products to Germany in exchange, along with other sort of commodities, in exchange for German high-tech goods, particularly weapons. Same sort of deal that's happening with the Romanians. The thing about the Soviets is that the Soviets are not a major exporter of oil at this point. Again, we have to sort of remember, like, world geography, the geography of oil is a little bit different. That Russia had been a significant exporter of oil before the First World War. Not as big as the United States, but big enough. The problem, of course, is that you have the First World War, then you have the Russian Civil War. I mean, immense amounts of suffering, untold sort of suffering for a decade that that goes on. Then you're slowly able to repair the damage that had occurred within territories that have been fought over by Bolsheviks, whites, Ottomans, Germans, the British. The British even tried to send a small force to Baku. It's which is a bit of a farce. It takes a long time to sort of undo all of that damage. They are able to, and then you have industrialization. And industrialization and rearmament means that all of your oil production basically is consumed internally. The Soviets are not able, as the Russians do today, to use oil as a sort of potential carrot to win over nations. To have preferential deals with nations in order to buck Western sanctions. They just don't have that ability because Soviet oil production is hobbled by the backward nature of the Soviet economy. It had Russia's development going back to Sergei Witte and others had been premised on the idea of importing Western capital and technology to do this. And this all dries up because of the First World War and the Bolsheviks' repudiation of the Tsarist debt. So nobody's going to really invest money in a pariah regime, the North Korea of its era. The German military would love to have a closer relationship with the Soviet Union because they're both revisionist powers, and the Germans can do things like practice with tanks and poison gas and aircraft in Soviet bases. But the Nazi regime is not very interested in that because the Soviet Union is not an ally against the West. The Soviet Union is a destination. It's not where it's you're doing all this precisely so that you can expand and achieve Lebensraum. Like, there's no room for allies when what you're seeking is Lebensraum. So the Soviets are aware of Germany's oil dependence, and they are also aware that oil is something that the Germans, would really want if there is some sort of a commercial relationship. And they use those oil exports very, how should we say? They use it to further Soviet foreign policy objectives, and Stalin is very pointedly, putting his thumb on the scale that oil exports to Germany will increase or decrease depending on relations with Germany. When relations are good with Germany, or when he doesn't think Germany is a threat, oil exports go down. They only go up when he's worried that relations are bad because he doesn't want Germany to attack the Soviet Union. Stalin's miscalculation is that he could somehow, in proper Marxist fashion, he believed that he could manage this by satisfying Germany's requirements, and that it was Germany's resource hunger that was driving its desire to attack the Soviet Union. So if he sent it, petroleum, this would somehow dissuade it from doing that. Again, he put a little bit too much trust in his ability to manage that relationship because the Germans are aware, they are sending advanced military equipment. They send a heavy cruiser of all things. They promise a heavy cruiser to the Soviets. And after the war, the Soviets go into German shipyards and say, well, you know, this was stuff that you were promised us. We want it. Like the Soviets make certain they get paid even after the Second World War. The Germans are aware during the war that, you know, how can we be sending advanced equipment to this country, you know, which is our enemy? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And oh, by the way, it's actually holding up our own sort of, you know, war effort and our own mobilization. And Hermann Goering like makes it very clear. Like he's a sort of leading, before Albert Speer's rise, he is a sort of, you know, leading figure within the German war economy. He just says like, enough of your belly aching, just do as you're told. Like, this has the highest priority. Give them what they want. The line being, you know, the rationale being, they're not going to be able to take advantage of it. We can take advantage of their raw materials faster than they can take advantage of our high-tech goods. As long as we get what we want, we will attack and destroy them before they can take advantage of these technologies. So stop complaining. Exports to the Soviet Union have the highest priority whatsoever. Just give them what they want. The nations that actually look at that relationship and want to exploit it are the British and French.
Right.
They're the ones who are really worried about that relationship because, you know, there are some in Germany, not just in conservative elites, you know, going back to, you know, Bismarck's time. They'd always wanted Germany, if it's not going to be allied to Britain and the West, it has to be allied to Russia. Or at least have a good relationship with Russia. Bismarck had leveraged Russia as a way of isolating France. Once once Wilhelm, you know, the second botched that relationship, Germany was encircled, you know, entirely by its own sort of incompetence. So German elites always wanted to sort of try to develop some sort of a closer relationship with Russia, either as a sort of subordinate partner or as a conquered territory. This thinking goes back well beyond the Nazis. So you know, there's this tendency, you know, towards, you know, there's already been this tendency towards Germany looking to the east and this Rapallo-Politik. And of course, most Soviet oil production at this time, today, it all happens in Siberia. But back then, it all happened in what's today Azerbaijan and Baku. And the people who are seeing this are the British and French. And they are aware of the fact that the Soviets are sending oil to Germany. And this is a source of supply that we can potentially, before the fall of France, that we can potentially interdict. Because, again, during the period of the Phony War, the Germans are competing for influence in Romania, but Romania is still a neutral. The British and French are still there. They're there in Greece. Romania is by no means, you know, an Axis satellite. So if you're looking at what are sources of imports that we can potentially threaten, I mean, attempts to bomb synthetic fuel facilities have been a disaster because the Royal Air Force can't hit the broadside of a barn. And its bombers get sort of slaughtered in daylight raids, and of course it can't see and hit anything at night, so you can't have precision bombing. They developed the idea of potentially the British and the French come up with this cockamamie idea of basically using their forces in Iraq and Syria to bomb the Soviet oil production facilities in Baku, precisely so that they can stop exports to Germany. I've seen these planning documents. I mean, it was a real thing. Had France not collapsed as quickly as it did when it did, the British and the French might have been dumb enough to have actually done this because, you know, their bombers, you know, the bombers that have the range to hit those targets, because they can't go through Turkey. Turkey is a neutral country. They have to go like the long way around. By the time you reach the target, you have to carry so much fuel that you can't really carry any bombs. What we saw from raids on Ploiești, you know, during the Second World War is that, you know, if you're really going to put these, facilities out of action, you got to hit them hard, not just once, but several times over and over again. I mean, the British and the French have no idea how complicated it is. They're actually thinking about attacking the Soviet Union in the spring of 1940. And that is, one of the great what ifs. Like, what if Britain and France had actually attacked the Soviet Union in 1940 and tried to knock out its oil? Because the Germans are aware that this is a possibility. And they're also worried, well, if we lose those supplies because Baku's cut off, like, can we compensate? And they're pretty certain they can. But everyone understands that if they destroy Soviet oil production, they will induce a famine in the Soviet Union. And doing that, they hope, will mean that the Soviet Union can no longer provide war material and supplies, supplies to the German economy. And that is, when we're talking about oil denial efforts, that's actually one of the more interesting sort of ideas that are floated before the fall of France, which completely, again, upends this whole thing. Once that's once that happens, well, France is not going to obviously play a role in attacking Baku. The British can't do it on their own. Romania now goes fully over to the Germans, providing with that extra bases of supply. Italy enters the war, and now suddenly all of Britain and France's planning had been premised on the idea that they would import oil from the Middle East, and that Middle Eastern oil had to go through the Mediterranean. There's no super tankers yet. That happens in the wake of the Suez crisis, that we develop large tankers that can efficiently move oil around the Cape of Good Hope. Everyone at that time is going through Suez, or they're going through pipelines in garden spots like Palestine or Lebanon or Syria. And of course, as the British find out, there are the Jews and Arabs in Palestine have, how should we say, fraught relations in the 1930s, and they're finding that maybe their oil pipelines to Haifa aren't as secure as they thought they would be, which means you're more reliant on Suez. But even then, you got to go through the Mediterranean, and you got to hope that a country the shape of a boot does not try to interfere with those oil exports. Before the war, the British put in a lot of effort thinking about how many convoys they need to run on a monthly basis. They're talking about 20 convoys a month running through the Mediterranean to make certain that they were shipping enough oil to the UK so that you would keep the Royal Navy supplied, and especially the Royal Air Force supplied. Once Italy enters the war, the Mediterranean is cut off, and without, in a sense, a single shot being fired. I mean, the British are very proud of the hammering they put on the Italian Navy, but it doesn't matter, because the Mediterranean's primary role was as a conduit for supplies going from east and west of Suez. And once the Mediterranean is closed, it's closed. It doesn't matter if you beat down the Italian Navy, because the Italians can still use land-based aviation or submarines or other things, or can get them from the Germans to try and import interdict those supplies. So the British and even the French that survived, which they don't, the British are now in a really, really bad position, because, yeah, the Germans don't have a lot of oil, but the British have none, because their whole strategy had been premised on the idea that they could rely on the Middle East. Now they're completely dependent on the United States to provide all of this. And the problem the British confront in 1940, as I say in my book, is the oil they could afford in the Middle East, they could not move because they didn't have enough tankers.
Right.
The oil that they could move from the Western Hemisphere, they couldn't afford because they didn't have enough dollars. So not only are you dependent on the Americans and their sphere to supply Britain, but you're also dependent on American charity, because the Americans have to support your oil imports, because basically, as Lord Lothian admitted, to American reporters somewhat undiplomatically when he came to the United States in 1940, he's like, "Boys, we're broke. Britain needs your money." That's the origins of Lend-Lease. Without Lend-Lease, without American charity, there is no British war effort. I mean, it's just there's no way of getting oil in sufficient quantities to make a difference for Britain to continue the war. British forces east of Suez are fine. They can rely on the Middle East. They can rely on the East Indies as long as the Japanese don't get involved. British forces west of Suez are in a bad position because the Mediterranean is closed because of the events of 1940.
Wow. I mean, brilliant stuff. So, and I'm clearly not as expert on this subject as you are. So recapping my simple ground-based combat brain, the British now in 1940, as you said they're going to be dependent on Lend-Lease, dependent on oil coming from the USA. We all talk about the fact that allegedly the great Churchill's sort of favorite day of the war is December the 7th, because then the USA are then committed to the war, et cetera, et cetera. But that's going to raise the very thorny issue of the fact the US will need its oil for its own campaigns, which will be extensive over massive distances, because every time we talk about the Pacific, we talk about the incredible distances there. So it's a bit of a Britain. Are Britain in a worse position in some ways than Germany because they are relying on that sort of sole route, whereas the Germans, even though their options are iffy, there are more than one of them. Is that a fair comment? Or have I simplified it too much?
No, I mean, so in the 1930s, the British have their own debate about whether or not they should have synthetic fuel. Like it's the same debate as they have, in Germany as well. They have it. There's a committee led by Viscount Falmouth, which sort of looks into the issue, and they make the argument that again, like this just costs way too much. I mean, the amount of money we would have to spend in order to make this, feasible is just extraordinary. We're better off using that money to expand production so we can generate earnings for imports from overseas or building war material to protect our sea lines. I mean, that's a decision that they make. What Britain's position is after 1940, to say it's worse off in the sense of it's dependent on the United States. Is that a plus or a minus? If you understand that the future, the rest of the 20th century will be the American century, it makes sense for you to rely on the United States. Britain had, this is something that British leaders had understood after World War I, but they had still they understood that, that power had flowed to the Western, to North America, that the Americans were the Americans were all the leading industrial producer of the world before the First World War. First World War confirmed that they were the leading financial power. The only thing that was left was military power, because they had not quite demonstrated the extent of their military power during the First World War. But already American industry, even before Pearl Harbor, is already firing on all cylinders. I mean, we sometimes forget that. People like to say, well, the New Deal failed to lift America out of depression. It was only World War II that restored American prosperity. And that's actually not true. The American economy starts going, through the roof when? October, November, December 1939. Why do you think that is? Because after the invasion of Poland, when Britain and France, enter the war, they basically pour money into Canada and the United States to expand war production, so that those factories can then supply the United States with those factories can supply Britain and France with the tools and various things that they need in order to wage war. Already Roosevelt is sort of modifying the neutrality acts so that Britain, the United States can supply Britain and France more directly, and they're even moving stuff to Canada so they can avoid the fiction of they can maintain the fiction of American neutrality while continuing to support the Allies. The Americans understand as early as 1938, in the wake of Munich, that war is coming and there has to be mobilization. Roosevelt makes the famous sort of remark to his military leaders after Munich that if the Allies had I don't remember what the number is. If the Allies had like 10,000 planes or 5,000 planes or whatever, Hitler would never have dared to sort of, make demands about the Sudetenland. There would never have been a need for a Munich conference. So the Americans are already committed towards mass production of aircraft and those kinds of commodities, which is really what those kinds of war material, which is exactly what the Allies need, because you don't want to get involved in a drawn out sort of land war in Europe. You want to rely on air and naval power to basically bleed Germany and sort of, slowly sort of, compress it and use amphibious operations wherever you can. That's how the Americans are going to be supporting the war effort. Now, as you said, once Japan is in the war, yes, supposedly that's going to be a drain on resources that can go to the UK. And that was actually one of the Germans, as far as we can tell, that was one of Hitler's rationales for declaring war on the United States after he had learned about Pearl Harbor. It's not the other way around. The United States doesn't declare war on Germany. It's Germany is on the United States, because there's a belief that the Germans had been trying to engineer Japanese foreign policy in a way that suited their needs. They encouraged the Japanese to go south rather than attack the Soviet Union because they wanted to distract the British and the French. They understood, the Germans felt that if the Japanese are directed towards Britain and France, America will be forced to privilege, its resources in the Pacific and starve Europe of resources. Doesn't really work because, well, yes, the Japanese do achieve major successes, and by wiping out Britain, France, and Holland sort of empire in Southeast Asia, you don't really need to worry about those resources or operations there anymore. The British are going to do most of their fighting, going to be based out of India, and the Americans are going to be basically moving towards staging out of Pearl Harbor and then out of Australia while they sort of, use their two-pronged assault against Japan. So it doesn't actually work out that there's a diversion of resources to the detriment of Britain, because it's also worth bearing in mind that the American economy is just so large that and there was so much slack capacity left over from the sort of failed recovery during the Great Depression, and there was slack capacity left over from the failed recovery. There was immense increases in American productivity during the 1920s and 30s, because one thing that you had realized in the Great Depression was, if we're going to stay in business, we have to be much more efficient at producing, because there's no real demand for our goods. So we had better be as mean as possible. So the American economy is to sort of think of it like as a Ferrari that's been left, in the garage, and it's just raring to go. All it needs is a little bit of fine tuning and fuel, and then it's just going to sort of take off. But that's how you need to see the American economy. So when we talk about oil, to give you a sense of, these commodities, these numbers don't mean a lot today, but they meant a lot back then. Overnight, the Americans can increase their oil production by from 3 million barrels a day to 4 million barrels a day. Like, it's just a billion. Like, it's an overnight sort of thing that they can do. Like, they had reduced production beforehand because they were producing so much oil in the 1930s that overproduction was leading to basically waste of oil and was leading to a collapse of the oil industry. All these companies were producing so much oil that there was no much demand. They were all collapsing. And so in the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, there's an effort to try and raise the price of oil by limiting production. It's weird. We think of high oil prices as a problem, but low oil prices are also a problem if they undermine the security of oil producers. America can only have a shale oil industry because oil prices are high enough for shale oil producers to try to make a profit. They've never been terribly profitable. But if oil was $20 a barrel, there'd be no need to invest in shale oil production in Texas or elsewhere. So think of that logic also applying in the 1930s. Oil is basically, it's almost worth nothing. I mean, there are these massive discoveries in Oklahoma and then in East Texas. So you have massive amounts of oversupply. And what you have is, I want to get into it so much because it's more American domestic politics, but there's a concerted effort to try and regulate internal oil production and keep it at a lower level than possible, keep output lower than the theoretical limit. Because again, there wasn't demand for oil and you needed to try and produce less to keep companies, in business. Once there's massive demand for oil, there's all of this, again, slack capacity you had left over in the 1930s. So, at the drop of a hat, you can basically increase your production by 25%, 33%. The Americans are producing, will end up, not quite doubling, but sort of increasing their oil production. I'd say, if again, I'm getting this off the top of my head, but they'll increase production by around 50 to 60% over the course of the war. I mean, it's a trivial amount compared to what America produces today. We produce far more today, but at the time, again, we were the major supplier of oil in the world, and we are. And again, when you add Venezuela into it, because Venezuela is the world's third largest producer of oil and largest exporter of oil, because all of that oil didn't go to the United States, it went to Europe. So we have so much oil. And that's leaving aside Mexico, which is sort of out of the game because of nationalization, but was always there as a possibility. So America, again, the story of oil is like the story of the American economy, that it had tremendous potential that was just that was just kept in check by a surfeit of demand. But its internal dynamism, once unleashed, meant that it would basically swamp anybody else, who stood in his path. In that sense, what's it? I'm having a senior moment, and I'm forgetting the name of Curzon. Lord Curzon makes a famous remark in 1918, and I should have really started with this, that the Allies floated on to victory on a wave of oil, and that's how all the books in the 1920s about oil start with this quote. Daniel Jurgen makes a big deal of it in his book The Prize, and it's not true. I mean, the Allies did not float to victory on a wave of oil in World War I. They most certainly did in the Second World War, and that wave came not from the Soviet Union. It didn't really come from Britain's empire, because Iran is a major supplier of oil. I mean, they discovered oil in Kuwait. There was huge oil fields in Iraq. The problem was they couldn't get that oil to where it was needed.
Right. Yes.
It is not enough to produce oil. It has to be, you need the right kind of oil, and you need to get it to consumers. The oil industry thinks in terms of what is known as upstream and downstream. Upstream is production. That is what exploration production. But if there's no downstream is transportation, refining, marketing. If you cannot get the oil to consumers, it does you no good. And if you cannot turn that oil into usable distillates, it will serve no purpose. And the United States, because of its central location, again, look at where it is on the map. If you're waging a war on opposite sides of the world, the United States is a much better place to do that than Europe can, or European suppliers necessarily can. And it produces the right kind of oil. And of course, it dominates the world's refining of oil as well. So it is that confluence of events, and of course the fact that, again, you had a massive amount of slack capacity that you could utilize in the event of a crisis, which meant that ultimately there is no Sophie's choice, when it comes to oil. You can as Churchill said, you can grind the Japanese and the Germans into powder. All it takes is the application of overwhelming force. Now that takes time, doesn't happen overnight, and that requires economic mobilization and management, and it requires harnessing your economic output, your military strategy. Like, this cannot happen overnight, but it can be done. And it is not, there are resource constraints even in the United States, but they're not the same as exist within basically a third world country with aspirations of greatness, which is what, for all intents and purposes, what Germany is. Japan peer is not even Germany. Japan's peer is more like Italy when you think about it. So,
well, amazing stuff. What we're going to do, as I said to you before we get live, is we're going to invite you back for a part 2, because we're kind of on the cusp of kind of 1939 now, which is kind of convenient point to kind of break it and bring you back. But there have been a couple of questions that have been coming up. So Gregory asked several times to ask you your opinion on Goralski's book, Oil and War. Any updates in the last 40 years? So, I mean, that's one of the earlier works on this subject. So a quick kind of reaction to that.
Okay. So not to put, I hate having to plug my work because it looks like self-serving.
No, I'll plug it for you then.
But, if you're going to understand, oil and the German war effort, whether it's, Jürgen relies on Goralski's book, essentially, and Goralski is using English language sources. Right. And that means he's sort of privileging, well, how did the Americans and the British see the war, and how did they evaluate the German war economy? And a lot of this actually has to do with the strategic bombing survey. It is the primary sort of, mechanism for understanding. It is our best attempt to understand how the German war economy functioned, and how resources constrained German military strategy. But the strategic bombing survey, because it was talking about strategic bombing, only talked about bombing of synthetic fuel plants. It didn't look at, well, what was Germany's actual foreign policy objectives regarding oil? One thing that my book does show is the intense interest, not just in Romania, which is really vastly understated. I mean, without Romania, you're not able in 1939 to sort of even think about waging, blitzkrieg, even under, these kinds of reduced circumstances. So you need Romania. And of course, how are the Germans thinking about the long-term fight? Because again, take Hitler's second book seriously. This is not about the war for Lebensraum will only be the opening salvo in a war for global domination. How do we win that war for global domination against the Americans? Part of that, and IG Farben executives are involved in that, and I've written an article that actually be published in the CIA's sort of public intelligence journal about this. One of the leading executives or policymakers in Germany is an IG Farben executive who makes the push that not only do we have to look towards the Soviet Union as a long-term producer of oil for Germany, but we also have to look towards the Middle East. And the Germans actually create a special oil company to operate in Romania, then in the Soviet Union, and eventually in the Middle East. That will be a counterpart to the American and British major oil companies as well. So all of that is sort of elided in Goralski and then in Jürgen, because they don't use German sources, and because they don't look at the German war effort from the German perspective, they're missing out on that. And so what I'd say is, again, Goralski, that book is fine. Jürgen is fine. But the issue is they're only as good as their sources. That's what I say about Jürgen. When Jürgen has good sources, it is a wonderful book, and the same would apply to Goralski. But if your sources are only English language, those sources at the time would only give you a sort of like a one-sided perspective. So I don't think you would really fully understand the complexity of Germany's oil policy, and I don't think it would really. One thing I learned, studying the relationship between oil and national power, was I thought I was learning about oil. I thought that this was what I was studying. This was what was important. What I realized, and this is again me showing the influence from Adam too, is what I was actually really interested in was money, because that is what oil is a synonym for. It's money. All right. It's oil allows you to basically export, so you can generate foreign exchange that way. It allows you to save, money by producing internally rather than producing through synthetics or importing oil. And oil is another way about talking about money. And rich nations have different tools at their disposal to deal with their energy needs than poor nations. Germany's choices are constrained by the fact that not just it is an oil poor nation, but it is a poor nation in general as well. And what I would say is, if you're going to understand why the British are making some of their decisions, you need to understand the close relationship between oil and finance. That, again, Britain is in this position where it doesn't, even in a world where it has access to all this oil, it cannot actually afford that oil. That was why you had tried to develop the Middle East. That's why even after the Second World War, the British maintained this fiction that they can still be a nation of any consequence in international affairs, because they think as long as there's a famous remark by a British statesman in the 1950s or 60s. I saw it once in an Adam Curtis documentary, but I think it really sort of encapsulates how Britain thought about the world after World War II. That is, they said, as long as we maintain access to Middle Eastern oil, the rubber and tin of Malaya, and the gold and precious metals of Southern Africa, Britain will continue to be a great power. Right? There's this notion that as weak as we are, as overshadowed as we are by these great powers, either the United States or the Soviet Union, we can somehow, by controlling these resources, be a great nation, because these are valuable resources that everybody else needs. And as long as we control access to them, even if we are industrially and militarily weaker, we will still be rich and powerful as a result. And it's that belief that, by controlling these resources, we can delay Britain's descent into irrelevancy just a little bit longer, that leads to the mess you see in Iran, where the British botch relations with Iran and basically put the Iranians in a position where they have to nationalize their oil industry rather than negotiating with them in good faith. This then leads to the MI6 CIA coup against Mossadegh, which of course has certain consequences for the Middle East development, and of course it leads to the abject humiliation of Suez, all of which is tied to, again, Britain's desire to use oil and use natural resources as a way of preserving its financial standing in the world at a time when its industrial and military position did not justify it being a great power. And I think, again, thinking about oil only in terms of, well, I'm putting gasoline into my tanks or my cars or my aircraft, I think it really does something of a disservice to understand just why this commodity is so important. Because if you don't have these capacities before the war, if you don't have a modern, vibrant, dynamic economy with adequate supplies of skilled labor and resources and capital before the war, you're not going to get it during a war, because there isn't enough time. So, and again, that is something I think when we're thinking about why the British are making these decisions and why they end up in a Britain did not want to be a ward of the United States. It understood that it would be a junior partner, but it did not want to be completely dependent on American goodwill. But it ends up in that position in large part because, I would argue, because of its oil deficiency and because of the mistaken policies it chose in the 1920s and 30s. After that, I mean, it's not a, forgive me, I just don't think Britain is a terrible, is a compared to the United States and the Soviet Union, I just do not think it is a terribly significant player in terms of the outcome of the war. And I say this as somebody who grew up in Canada, who studied in the UK. This is not to denigrate the heroism and sacrifice, but when we're talking about who is doing the most killing of Germans and
the heavy lifting,
it's if it wasn't for Britain's geographic positioning, I'm really not certain it would have been a major player in how things turned out.
No, fair points. And I mean, brilliant stuff. I mean, one of my favorite things about a really good World War II TV show is I know, like me, my audience can be spending the next 2 or 3 hours staring into space, just processing all the amazing stuff you've thrown into our heads, because I had no idea that money was going to be such a big factor. I thought it was going to be more logistics, although I think that's going to come in the second part, because I'm definitely inviting you back when we get into the actual war itself, so to speak. But we had a good comment, which I would like you to get a reaction to, then we'll bring things to an end. I just like the way it was, no, not this one, here we go. Can we say that oil represented strategic mobility, but strategic mobility was needed to obtain and use oil, sort of a yin yang going on?
I'm not certain I understand the question. If I'm going to take a stab at this, and I hope the user will forgive me if I'm sort of missing the mark. We have to again think of it in terms of it's not enough to have oil. I need to have the ability to move the oil to where it is I need to, and that requires certain decisions, certain actions in terms of obviously safeguarding my sea lines of communication, making certain the Germans do not sink too many of my ships. You have to think about all of these steps if you're going to properly take advantage of this oil. So yes, mobility or security is essential towards thinking about how I'm supposed to take advantage of these oil imports. And so the example that I would use is that where is most American oil production? Most American oil production at this time is concentrated in the Gulf of Mexico. And in peacetime conditions, it makes sense. Rather than building pipelines all across America, I simply ship the oil, via the Gulf. I mean, the West Coast is supplied by California. Mainly, I'm thinking about how I'm going to supply, say, New England in the Mid-Atlantic. I'm just going to ship that oil out of Houston. I'm going to send it around the Gulf to consumers in the Northeast. What's the problem? Germans keep sinking my tankers. I mean, the Germans make a very concerted effort, with Operation Drumbeat to sort of target American, British, and Dutch tankers in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, on the East Coast. And so the Americans are caught in this position where they have lots and lots of oil, but they can't get it to where it needs to go. New England is an energy desert. And how can there be an energy desert in the country that produces more oil than the rest of the world combined? So the Americans have to then expend tremendous amounts of resources creating pipelines to basically try to link the East Coast with Texas. That comes at the expense of other kinds of war production. So always think in terms of how do I get this commodity to where I need? I'm always think in terms of trade-offs. If I do this, what am I giving up in order to achieve that? Every economy, no matter how wealthy, must at some resources, especially in wartime, resources will never be sufficient for your requirements. Your requirements in any nation will always exceed your resources. You have to make choices. Those choices come off with trade-offs. Those trade-offs, you cannot measure, trade-offs purely in terms of economic efficiency, because this is wartime. Wars are not run on the basis of economic efficiency. War is the most inefficient thing I can think of. You are making decisions on the basis of military necessity, political realities, diplomatic, constraints, financial constraints. Choosing between these alternatives require trade-offs, and that is the most important thing that I would say to understand this. Like, think of it in terms of I need to maintain this sort of seamless web between everything from the production of oil to its consumption. If I'm going to achieve that, that requires a certain set of investments. That investment requires trade-offs. What are the costs of those trade-offs? What are the benefits of those trade-offs? What am I giving up in terms of opportunity cost? I think that's, I'm not trained as an economist, but some of this sort of very basic economic thinking, like the stuff that you would learn in a first-year economics sort of, lecture, I think some of this stuff about thinking about choice under scarcity is really is a valuable tool when thinking about military strategy.
Well, I'm going to send you an email in about 2 minutes time to set up a part 2 of this, because this has just been absolutely incredible. This has absolutely moved into my top 10 shows of all time, which is a high praise. I knew it was going to be good, but it went in directions I wasn't expecting it to. So thank you so much for your time, sir. Absolutely brilliant stuff. The viewers have been enjoying it as well. We'll get to the second part and we'll get to some questions the next one. But right now, I'm going to say, in a weird way, folks, we're kind of continuing this conversation tomorrow because we've got a show with Richard Dunn about exploding fuel tanks. So we haven't finished talking about that as a subject. And then on Friday, we're talking about Churchill and his reaction to D-Day. So lots of stuff coming up. As I said earlier at the beginning of the show, the links to the doctor's book are in the description below. I urge you to go and get it. I know some of you in the sidebar have bought it during the show, so that's fantastic. And there's other work and lectures and things on YouTube you can search for. But right now, I'm going to say thank you very much, Dr. Toprani, because that's been absolutely amazing. I'm going to need to have a lie down with a wet blanket over my face or something, because that's really rocked my world. So you are a superstar, sir. I will see you again, folks, tomorrow. And thank you again. This has been extraordinary. Cheers, everybody. Bye.